Please welcome to the stage U.S. Secretary of the Department of Treasury, Janet Yellen, and Ron Brownstein, a senior editor with The Atlantic.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, I feel like we're having a dinner party that we've under-invited for. I mean, do you know if Merrick Garland or Jennifer Granholm are doing anything this afternoon?
I'm sure they'd love to join you
exactly.
as well.
Well, let me start by asking you about, thank you for joining us. We're going to talk about the broader Biden economic agenda, but I want to start another member of the federal government, the Federal Reserve Chairman, a job that you used to have.
Yes.
Yesterday, forecast a world in which interest rates would be elevated, at least compared to recent experience, for a sustained period with interest rates reaching 4.6% in 2023. He said this was unfortunate, but unavoidable. I know you don't want to second guess someone who has the job that you once had. So let me ask you, what are the implications for the American economy if the Fed continues on the course that they set out yesterday?
So first, let me say, I think inflation has been running at unacceptably high rates. It is a huge issue for every American household. It's leading to a great sense of economic insecurity for Americans. And we don't want to see it become endemic. Since I lived through the 1970s when we had a long period of high inflation, it is President Biden's top economic priority to get it down. And that's what the Fed is trying to do. Now, some of the inflation is coming from supply chain bottlenecks relating to the pandemic and the shifts we saw in patterns of spending. And I think those, we can see some early evidence that that's beginning to resolve, but it's still contributing to inflation. And Putin's completely unacceptable and immoral war against Ukraine has led to a surge in energy and food prices that's also contributing to inflation. The administration has done what it can to ease supply chain bottlenecks and to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That's helped. But we also have a very tight labor market. And many Americans dropped out of the labor force when the pandemic struck. There's been some rebound, but not as large as might have been expected.
Does the position of workers in the labor market have to erode? Does it have to weaken in order for inflation to come under control?
Well, it looks like there probably is some inflationary pressure that's stemming from the labor market. And I think it's the Fed's job, as Chair Powell said, to address demand-supply imbalances. Now, I believe there is a path through this that can succeed in bringing down inflation while also maintaining what I think all of us would regard as a strong labor market. And I very much hope that the Fed will be able to succeed in doing that. Because
as you may have seen yesterday, one of your predecessors, Larry Summers, who, as you know, is a shy, retiring type.
Yes.
He had a whole reaction, as he often does, to the Fed announcement, and he made one very specific prediction. He said, quote, "Happy to bet anyone that we will see 6 months of employment above 5 before we see 6 months of inflation below 2.5. Would you take that bet?
Look, I don't want to get into the prediction game of exactly what it's going to take. I have confidence in the Fed. I've been there. I believe deeply that we should have an independent central bank and that they should make the judgments about what's required. Probably they need to ease some labor market pressure, but I certainly don't want to say that the unemployment rate has to rise that high.
And before I turn to the broader economic, one last question in this area. In your previous answer, I think you were saying that you believe the Fed can bring down inflation without triggering a full-scale recession?
Well, I think of a full-scale recession as a period when there's excessive unemployment. You don't have a strong labor market. We have one of the tightest labor markets right now we've had in American history. And, I believe we can continue to have what most Americans would regard as historically low unemployment rates and a strong labor market where people can find jobs. Right now, we have 2 job openings for every unemployed worker, and I think that's putting inflationary pressure into the system. But we can still have a good, strong labor market without quite so much pressure on wages and prices.
I know I said last question, Terry, but there's one other. The Fed chairman, he basically prophesized or projected a world in which we will be fighting this fight for quite a while. Do you see a possibility that inflation will be essentially under control by the end of next year before we are full on into the presidential race? Or is this something we're still going to be dealing with in a serious way into 2024?
Well, I believe it's going to come down certainly next year, although let's be clear, there are risks. The Russian invasion of Ukraine hasn't come to an end. We're seeing Putin weaponize oil and gas in fighting this war. So we remain vulnerable to supply shocks. But I think the Fed is clearly committed to bringing inflation down, and I expect that to be successful.
2023, you think will be a better year?
I think it'll be better. 2% is the goal, and perhaps we don't get there next year, but I certainly expect to see inflation come down.
So you went to Michigan earlier this month and gave a speech pulling together some of the major themes of the Biden economic agenda. And one specific assertion you made in that speech really caught my eye. You said, taken together, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act authorize among the most significant investments our country has ever made. There are many provisions in those bills incenting domestic manufacturing in a variety of different fields, and obviously undertaking direct projects themselves through the infrastructure bill. What is the magnitude of the economic activity and private investment that you think this public investment can unlock?
Well, I believe it will unlock a huge flow of private investment. Clean energy is probably the most important example where we're seeing massive plans to expand in that area, given the incentives in both the Infrastructure Act and in the Inflation Reduction Act. But look, the incentives we have for semiconductor production in the United States, clearly we're hearing major plans to expand capacity in semiconductors in the United States. And more generally, I see these 3 pieces of legislation as investing in critical ways in our economy to make us more productive and also more resilient. And we're investing in ways we haven't in the past, because supply-side economics, as it's normally been characterized in the United States, is all about incenting one kind of investment, private investment in plant and equipment. And when you think about the productive capacity of the economy, there's a lot more to the supply side than private investment in plant and equipment. We have underinvested in public infrastructure for a very long time, and I think it's really hampered productivity. And we've seen that clearly during the pandemic when we've had difficulty moving goods, shipping goods. Our ports require investment, our roads require investment. Broadband is a critical component of inadequate infrastructure in a modern economy. These bills invest in that, along with energy security, semiconductors. And, we have fallen now as a country to 10th in the world in terms of our R&D spending, public R&D spending, as a share of GDP. And that wasn't always the case. And there is a major expansion of fundamental research that's enabled by the Infrastructure Act. Also incentives to, there's human capital and training workers, educating them.
That's the piece of the stool that got squeezed out quite a bit in the free community college, the universal pre-K, other measures to expand skills. Talk about your view. Is it enough to have the incentives on this side of the ledger, basically tax and infrastructure incentives for investment, for private investment? Do you need the other side, the human capital investments?
Well, I think human capital is also important. And you're right that some of the things that the Biden administration really would like to prioritize were not done in this set of legislation, and they remain, whether it's free community college or 2 years of universal early childhood education. I think those things remain on the to-do list, but there are incentives in these bills for workforce training, in the energy, clean energy provisions. There are incentives to to hire apprentices and to teach them on the job training.
In some ways, it may be easier for legislators to see incentives to put concrete in the ground than to put a kid in pre-K. I would ask you another point you make in your speech, and which is a theme running through these bills, is the question of dispersing growth more equitably and more widely. I mean, you note that, especially in the information age, we are seeing economic opportunity, venture capital investment, college graduate location, really concentrating into a smaller number of superstar cities, largely along the coast. I mean, this has been a really impervious force, very hard to reverse. Do you think these bills give you a fighting chance to have what Steve Case calls a rise of the rest?
That really is a very important objective, that in making these investments, we want to see them dispersed across the country. And in many of the investments that are being announced in the clean energy area, I was recently, as you mentioned, in Detroit, visited the EV factory for Ford's new F-150 trucks, to make sure, and also in the energy area, to make sure, as we move away from fossil fuels, that communities that are harmed by the closing of mines or shutdown of fossil fuels, that they enjoy an offset from clean energy.
And there are specific incentives for that, right? For hydrogen and others?
There are specific incentives, and I think that there will be a big spur to manufacturing, and that's likely to be dispersed across the country. But there are many incentives to disperse investment and to make sure that as we transition to clean energy, the communities that are have been dependent on fossil fuels aren't left behind. And this is important because I really think it's contributed to polarization in the country, to have especially the coasts enjoy rapid growth. And of course, with rising housing prices in these areas,
they're not happy
it's
either.
not easy. Well, true, but it's also not easy for people in places that are not enjoying growth to move to those growing places that have so many job opportunities.
The energy focus brings us another area of both your speech and something you wrote in The Atlantic this morning, talking about economic resilience.
Yes.
We hear resilience in terms of climate or natural disasters. What does it mean in an economic sense to you?
To me, economic resilience means that we will be less affected by supply shocks. We have been greatly affected by supply shocks over the last several years. I mean, first, a global pandemic that has had a worldwide impact on growth, and then a war that's greatly affected energy and food prices. And we're also increasingly seeing the impact of climate change, more droughts, more stress in areas of the world that already suffer from hunger and inadequate food supplies. And at a minimum, most researchers expect that intensifying climate change will lead to more hurricanes, droughts, fires, things that will have impacts on farms and firms, and create supply chain challenges. So along with wanting a more productive economy, we think it's also important to have a more resilient economy. And I think energy is the best example.
Is resilient a synonym for self-sufficiency? Is it autonomy? Is this an idea that we have to basically make more things and control more supply chains here in the US? And how does that fit in with the general thrust over the last 50 years toward a more globalized economy? Are we walking back from that?
Well, I think we have to realize that there are security threats that we face when we become overly dependent, especially on countries that we have real geopolitical tensions with. In the case of China, there are rare earths, solar panels, electric battery components that we are really too dependent on China for, and I think we would be better off having more production in the United States. But take the case of semiconductors. The only country in the world that is a source of the most advanced semiconductors is Taiwan. And I would regard that as a resilience risk and also a national security risk. But self-sufficiency, doing everything ourselves, I think is not the answer. I've been talking about a concept we call friendshoring, which is we want to maintain the benefits of trade in the global economy. It enables us to do things more efficiently. And sometimes resilience is having multiple sources of supply, not just at home, because as we've seen, for example, in the case of baby formula, when you're very dependent on a small number of domestic firms, things can also happen that reduce resilience. So working with trusted partner countries around the world.
Friendshoring means what? Shifting our supply chains to people that we are geopolitically aligned with? Is that essentially?
That we regard as trusted suppliers that we feel comfortable with.
And can we have an EV, solar, clean energy revolution solely with friends? I mean, is there access to the raw materials we need solely in kind of a friend-shoring world, or ultimately do you need China?
Well, we are highly dependent on China for things like lithium and processing of some of the minerals that go into electric batteries. But I believe the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act will lead, and we're already hearing announcements of it, of developing sources of supply here.
Even Tesla talking about moving a battery factory from Europe to the U.S.
I think it is possible to both mine these minerals and process the minerals in the United States and other countries that we're comfortable with relying on.
You've mentioned several times the shocks to the global economy from the war in Ukraine. You've been at the forefront of all of our efforts to deal with sanctions and to impose pain on Putin and Russia. One effort of that is the cap on oil. You got a big world, China, India, others may or may not want to participate. Can you draw the net tight enough to make a difference in Russia, in their calculation?
Well, the truth is, I think we're already seeing a difference. Russia is now seeking very actively to find places to sell their oil. They're giving enormous discounts to China and to India, who are two big purchasers. It's important to realize that in early December, Europe, which is currently buying about 3 million barrels a day of crude and refined product, is going to stop the bulk of those purchases, and Russia is going to be looking for other countries to sell it to. And both the European Union and the G7, we're implementing a ban on the provision of any services that are involved in the transport of Russian maritime oil, whether it's insurance or trade finance or brokering. And at the moment, the UK and the EU provide 90% of insurance that's needed, that's used in the transport of maritime oil. So Russia's going to be in a position where they're going to need to find a lot of new customers. And just to be clear, the EU, the US, the G7, we're not buying Russian oil. They are going to be looking especially to emerging markets, to developing countries, of course to China, to India, to big countries like that, but also to developing countries that have really, that are their partners, that work with them, and that are suffering greatly from high oil prices. So what the price cap does is enable Russia to continue selling and using these services, having access to them, or their customers having access to them, as long as they sell below a cap that we will set. And it'll be at a price that covers their costs, and it is a price that they have accepted in the past. So all countries that are potential purchasers of Russian oil, their bargaining power is enhanced by that. They need premium services. Anything that Russia or China can provide by way of insurance or other services are more expensive. They want access, those customers, to premium services. And the cap is a tool to enhance their bargaining power, and we're already seeing it work.
Can the EU decouple from Russian energy broadly without going into recession? And if they do, what would that mean for us?
Well, they're committed to doing that.
Right.
Russia shut them off mainly from natural gas, and they've committed, with very modest exceptions, to cease purchasing Russian oil in December.
And how great a risk does that create of recession in Europe, in your view?
Well, it's a difficult thing to accomplish. We're working closely with our European neighbors to help them find alternative supplies. I believe they can, but we've seen energy prices skyrocket in Europe, and it's going to be a very tough winter for them. We're not nearly as exposed. We of course have seen spillovers, but we're not as exposed as they are. It's going to be a tough winter.
And how exposed are we to the motor of their economy? In other words, if their economy is significantly slow from this, how much at risk are we from that?
Well, we trade with Europe, of course, and so there is some impact, but I wouldn't exaggerate how large it is for the U.S. growth prospects.
Secretary Yellen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us this
afternoon.
afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.